Hello and welcome all of you to this lecture series on pathways and paradigms for India's G20 presidency. I'm your host Samina Hamid and I'm joined by Professor Shrikant Kondapalli, eminent expert on China's foreign and security policies. Professor Shrikant Kondapalli is the Dean of School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Formerly, he was a chairperson of Center for East Asian Studies, SIS-JNU. His scholarship in Chinese studies has been enriched by his education both in India and China. He learned Chinese at Beijing Language and Cultural University and was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at People's University, Beijing. Professor Kondapalli has an illustrious academic career spanning over 3 decades. Before joining JNU in 2006, he was a research fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. He has been visiting professors at several universities in China like Shandong, Xiling, Yunnan Finance and Economic University. He was also a visiting fellow at China Institute for Contemporary International Relations, Beijing, and a non-resident senior fellow at People's University, Beijing since 2014. He has been a prolific writer with several books, monographs and research articles to his credit. He is also the guest faculty of several defense colleges and institutes in India like National Defense College, Army War College, among others. Professor Kondapalli is the Editor-in-Chief of International Studies, journal published by SIS-JNU. He also received the prestigious K. Subramaniam Award in 2010 for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kondapalli.
There is gift too. Thank you very much.
Professor Kondapalli, great to have you here. Today we are going to hear him talk on China's role in G20. China's rise has been phenomenal in the last few decades. It has inspired some, it has intimidated the others. Its relation with many parts of the world has oscillated from cooperation to context. The figures that we have now is that China is slowing down, almost teetering to the point of deflation. Professor Kondapalli will talk us through what it means for China's role in G20. Professor Kondapalli, welcome. We are pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much, Samina, colleagues, students, researchers, and friends. The topic today is the Chinese role in G20 process, and we would expect Chinese president to attend the G20 meeting next month. He is in South Africa now to attend the BRICS meeting, and possibly some deliberations will be made at that time as well in terms of the agenda for the G20 meeting. Just to provide a context for what could be the role of China in G20 process, we need to go back to the 1970s when China began the reform and opening up policies. So they announced in 1975 and in 1978 the 4 modernizations program in agriculture, industry, defense first, and then science and technology, which was reversed in the order of agriculture, industry, and science and technology and defense. So with that reform program, they began to restructure their entire economy, and soon they picked up economic growth rates. There is the GDP obsession within China in the process of this economic and reform program. So in agriculture, they had the sideline production reforms, and then subsequently to the market economy. Commercialization of agriculture took place, and then surpluses generated, which did provide some for the industrialization process. Within industry, they have created special economic zones, and through special economic zones, export processing and exports, of course, and the joint venture companies were formed. A number of agreements were signed with several countries, initially with Taiwan, Singapore, and then South Korea, Japan, European Union countries, as well as the United States, Canada, and other countries. So these joint venture companies were able to produce extensively for the external market. So much so today the Chinese exports constitute nearly 40 to 50% of the GDP, and the GDP is $19.6 trillion. So that is quite a huge, say for example, China has about $4 trillion of exports and imports compared to 1.1 trillion that India was able to get last year of the entire trade component. So China has reached these and became the largest trading partner for nearly 128 countries. Through these export processing zones, the special economic zones, they wanted to establish nearly 4,000 special economic zones. After that, of course, they were able to establish only 2,000 odd SEZs. They also had trouble like our Nandigram and others in West Bengal when protests began, and then they shut down these SEZs. In Kwangtung province, Wukan village had risen in revolt against the special economic zone. So they also had similar troubles like we had in establishing the special economic zones. But what is more important is that they have displaced Japan as the second largest economy by 2010. They have displaced Germany as the high-tech trade country, exporting country, roughly around 2012. And today they are the largest in terms of trading. They also displaced the US substantially in terms of number of automobile production or others. In the WTO, joining WTO in 2001 facilitated a number of advantages for China, including in terms of the various sectors like agriculture, industry. They also had, they did not open up completely the stock exchanges, but that is one area where there is still some control. Automobile sector is one of the major benefits that China received as part of the WTO entry, and today they produce about 24 million units. United States produces about 14 million. So that's the scale of production that China made with these reforms and opening up and focusing on the economic aspects. In terms of manufacturing, at one time the GDP of China used to have about 59% of the contribution made by the manufacturing sector, and today of course it has come down to about 40%. That is because there is in the 13th five-year plan and 14th five-year plan, there is some restructuring, domestic restructuring that has been undertaken, which means that they are now focusing mainly on the service sector or high-tech service sector, and secondly in terms of domestic consumption. Probably India is one of the lessons that they have learned, because there are several delegations from China came to India in order to learn our kind of model in terms of the domestic consumption. We have very high domestic consumption in India, roughly about 59%. Please correct me, Amita, on this. So there is the restructuring process that has happened in the Chinese economic structure. 14th five-year plan is much more pronounced in terms of what do they achieve in this. That is, they in 11 areas they want to become superpower, including in high-tech manufacturing, in shipbuilding, in new technologies like AI, drones, space, automation, nano, and other fields. So 11 areas have been identified as areas where China would be able to graduate to become a high-tech country, and including sports and culture. in these, as you know, generally China is at second or third position in Olympics medals. So this is one area where China is also trying to become a superpower in the sports arena. So this is the context, the 14th five-year plan providing China with much more resilience in terms of the next stages. This is through the Made in China 2025 program, which was launched in 2015, in which there is 80 to 90% of the products that China would consume would be gathered through the Made in China 2025 campaign. That is, in other words, China will resource much of these through the Chinese own efforts in AI, Internet of Things, 3D printing, and a host of other subjects. So this is the context for China's presence in the G20. So it is primarily in the economic sphere that China has focused extensively. So what are the basics of China's presence in G20? As we discussed, China is the largest trading country in the world today, and that means it utilizes the WTO provisions extensively. However, we also need to remember that the largest or some of the largest anti-dumping duties are imposed on Chinese products. So in other words, there is also the friction that is generated in Switzerland, US, Canada. India is the fourth largest in terms of also the anti-dumping duties in terms of the, but China is also floating a lot of FTAs. They have roughly about 13 FTAs, free trade area agreements, and RCEP and other arrangements have further enhanced the Chinese economic capabilities in terms of basically exports sector. China also launched an Import Expo exhibition in Shanghai about 4 years ago, and this was created by Li Qiang, who is the Shanghai Party Secretary at that time, who now becomes the Premier of the State Council. Not that the Premier is the most powerful, but as the protege of Xi Jinping, Li Qiang's influence is pretty high these days since the National People's Congress and the previous 20th Party Congress session in October last year. So China today has become the second largest economy, $19.6 trillion. And in terms of investments, they have something like $1.4 trillion of investments abroad. Much of this is in the energy sector, but there are also now in the commodities, in other sectors, manufacturing. And recently, in the last one decade or so, the Belt and Road Initiative projects have also resulted in further investments. So while official figures are missing in terms of exact amount, American Enterprise Institute, where Derek Caesars works on these aspects, suggested to about $1.4 trillion of investment. But today there is also a mixing up of the investments with the BRI projects. For example, BRI was launched in 2013, but prior to that, any investments that were made are now also part of the BRI project. So there is some confusion regarding the investment profile. Well, what is crucial is that out of the 120 countries which joined the BRI in one form or the other, China had invested about $956 billion. So in other words, they have provided for investment opportunities in infrastructure in these BRI related matters. Now, for various reasons, the BRI issues have been relatively dormant recently due to COVID restrictions, as well as the backlash from the other countries. As you know, the Cromwell meeting created the Build Back Better World concept with a $45 trillion projections for investments abroad in infrastructure and other projects. There are also the sustainable development initiatives of European Union. Then there is the AAGC, Africa Asia Growth Corridor. We have our own project MAUSAM, which is of course a non-starter, and other initiatives like Shinzo Abe's quality infrastructure projects and others. So with all this, there is a certain reluctance to hold the BRI summit meetings, mainly the criticism and the actions of other countries, and of course the Chinese issues related to COVID isolation and the problems that we all faced during the pandemic. Now the third summit meeting of the BRI is supposed to be held somewhere this year. We do not know exactly when, but roughly October, November has been suggested. So it is still not clear when will the most crucial thing is the BRI projects have 5 connectivities. One is policy coordination, which is much closer to the G20 kind of policy coordination. Second is the physical infrastructure, that is energy pipelines, roads, railways, airfields, fiber optics and others. Third is in terms of trade promotion. Again, here the G20 process is relevant for the Chinese. That is a crucial. The fourth one is in terms of renminbi internationalization. And here again, as the BRICS meeting is due today, the discussions related to regional currencies, trading in regional currencies and others is one important aspect, which G20, the agenda of the Chinese in G20 is also part of that. Regional currencies, exchanges in regional currencies is one where they are looking at some prospects in this. Finally, they also have the tourism or people-to-people contacts, which is not part of the G20 as such. So through the BRI projects, China has become an alternative investment provider for infrastructure projects, which the G20 since its inception in 1999 was looking at the Asian financial crisis and the subsequent global financial crisis, and what are the ways that we can invest in the infrastructure projects in developing countries or others. Somehow or the other, the IMF and World Bank were sucked into the Eurozone crisis that emerged during this time, 2008-9 onwards. The PIGS countries, the Portuguese, Italy, Greece, Spain, they have relatively attracted more investments from these lending agencies, and so there is a need for investment that the developing countries were looking at. And so the BRI projects were helpful in that aspect. Of course, there is also a criticism that the BRI is not transparent and that the investments have resulted in debt diplomacy, and much of the BRI projects have been hijacked by the state-owned enterprises. For example, the Washington-based CSIS did a survey of the BRI projects and found that 93% of the contracts were actually taken away by the SOEs, state-owned enterprises in China. So in other words, only 7% is left for the other global lenders or even Chinese private enterprises. So this is the broader context for the Chinese role in the G20. So this opening up of China facilitated China to become the second largest economy and have stakes now in the global economic order, which the G20 is trying to resurrect and trying to facilitate the coordination and other aspects. So China's specific role in G20 is related to about 5 areas. Number one is trade, which is what the G20 also is looking at in terms of how do we further trade aspects and so on. Investments, that is again an area where the G20 is interested and has been coordinating with various agencies in terms of, number one, how do we overcome the financial crisis and maintain financial stability and so on and so forth. In this process, the Chinese suggest that they never have devaluated renminbi the Chinese currency during the Asian financial crisis. As you all know, the stock exchanges fell down during the Asian financial crisis. Hong Kong and some Southeast Asian countries. South Korean stock exchanges also were affected substantially during that time. So China's claim is, number one, that they did not devaluate their currency and created this financial stability at that time. Secondly, that this is pegged onto the US dollar in a limited manner. Of course, that has also resulted in a lot of criticism that Chinese renminbi is undervalued compared to other global currencies, and so this is one major issue. The US, EU and other major trading partners like Japan, South Korea keep raising without any substantial Chinese interventions. So this is another issue that has come about, the financial stability as a third item in the G20 process. The fourth, in terms of the climate change issues, as you all know, the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, they have articulated after the Copenhagen summit meeting in 2009 about the equal but differentiated responsibilities, which basically means then that the developing countries should have some space before they could graduate towards manufacturing sector and create jobs for people, and the developed countries, G7, should focus more on creating, say for example, the coal liquefaction process, which the developed world has been able to generate through their own R&D and others, Japan specifically. And so the developing countries could, when they switch over from coal to other renewable sources, they will be able to provide some sustenance to these developing countries. So equal but differentiated responsibilities were proposed since Copenhagen, and of course China joined the Lima meeting, the Durban meeting, as well as the Paris 2015, December 2015 agreement on how to cap the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Now roughly we have about 25 to 30 tons of emissions in the globe today, and China is the second largest after the United States, and India is far below, but India accommodated China in the basic format in terms of these equal but differentiated responsibilities. Jairam Ramesh at the time was the environment minister. He said we bailed out the Chinese from the international pressures on the climate change issues, because if you are part of the developed countries, then number one, as the Paris meeting had indicated, you have to contribute to the $100 billion fund for the switchover from the polluting energy sources to that of renewables. So there is an effort here of China utilizing some of the G20 processes, like they have utilized the climate change related discussions, of utilizing their developing country status in order to also get concessions. One in a genuine manner, the other is in terms of the concessions provided by these regimes for China. And this has triggered some domestic debates within China. Overall on G20, for those who are not aware about the domestic aspects of China, there is during early 1980s, Deng Xiaoping, the then leader, proposed a principle called Tao Kuang Yang Hui, which roughly translated as keeping a low profile and focusing on economic development. Now Xi Jinping came into power in 2012 and suggested to what he mentioned as Fan Fa You Wei, and roughly translated as accomplishing something. And so we saw the assertiveness of China in many fields, and also in the WTO negotiation process and climate change and others. So I was trying to mention this fourth agenda in the G20 on climate change to suggest that while China is making much strides in renewable energies, they have been very aggressive as well in switching over. For example, one of the APEC meetings was held in Beijing, and almost overnight they switched off the environment by simply removing all the steel plants from Beijing or other closer areas. Paotou Steel used to produce a lot of pollution, and they just shut down these factories and removed. Of course, they put it up in Inner Mongolia, which is now polluting a lot of these areas. So what is important here is that China did some efforts on the climate change proposals, and today it is switching over from coal to the other renewable sources. 60% still of Chinese energy is through the coal process, and the other sources of energy increasingly are in solar panels, wind energy, nuclear energy, as well as the gas, which also majority of that is imported from Turkmenistan and other countries. So China is making efforts in this climate change, but also trying to utilize the BRICS countries, mainly BRICS countries, in terms of these equal but differentiated responsibilities. So it provides a cushion for China. So one of the debates here is do not flowing from the concept of Tao Kuang Yang Hui, that is keeping a low profile, not to gang up with other countries in countering the United States in the G20 process. We all know US is the largest GDP country in the world today, with roughly about $24 trillion. With China's ambitions at the global level, the frictions are obviously quite clear in the G20 as well. So one of the domestic debate is keep a low profile, do not attack the United States in the G20 or US allies, the G7 countries in the G20 process. So this is one debate that we see. The second debate we see is that China should actively pursue. They use the word active, in many of their negotiations, in terms of getting the concessions for China in very many areas. WTO, for example, when China joined WTO after nearly 16-17 years of negotiations, today, for instance, the US, European Union countries, Japan, South Korea, they all complain about the protectionist trends within China in terms of allowing the commerce from abroad. Many of these companies are discriminated on, and so there is a huge, so this dichotomy between free trade and protectionism. So China keeps on mentioning that they are following a free market economy, but nevertheless not disclosing the protectionist trends within China. For example, I mentioned about currency. There is also the stock exchanges, securities area within WTO. They need to be opened up. However, the Chinese have not opened up this sector as well. On currency, again, financial and services, the Chinese have not completely opened up. For example, many of your credit cards will not be of any use in China. That is one. Also, the banking system, insurance systems are of concern from a WTO standardized mechanisms. So while Xi Jinping or his predecessors mentioned that China is the leader of globalization, we still see a lot of trends which are protectionist in nature, that China has not completely opened up its economy for foreign competition. For example, none of the state-owned enterprises in China have allowed the Indian software. No company in China has the Indian software, the state-owned enterprises. Likewise, the Indian pharmaceutical companies are discriminated. Some of you who are learning Chinese language or you may have seen the movie Opushri Yaoshan. That is a movie where the Chinese demand for pharmacy products, that is the generic products that we generate, the Indian pharmacies generate, have all been stopped or not allowed in the Indian market. You may also recall that many Chinese visitors who come to India, they all request us to get some cancer curing drugs, each one buying a lakh rupees worth of and carrying with them, although their state has kind of put restrictions on Indian pharma products. It is mainly the European lobbies who actually work in this pharma sector in China. That is the main concern. What I was trying to say is that while China is saying that it is the leader of globalization, such as the speeches by Xi Jinping in Davos, there is nevertheless a concern that China also has a protectionist trend. Indicator is the anti-dumping duties as well as the other measures that the WTO asks any signatory country, member country, to observe those WTO provisions. So this is the context for China and its role in the G20 process. China did make some contributions. For example, in the Bali summit, China pushed through an agenda on food security. Also during the global financial crisis, putting pressure on the developed countries to invest more in the developing markets, mainly in the infrastructure projects. And as I was mentioning, unilaterally also China had invested in the BRI projects, the Belt and Road Initiative. So China's contribution to the global economy, and which the G20 primarily is concerned with, not about Ukrainian conflict, but primarily about economic resurrection. China did contribute much in this process of global, although it is driven mainly by its own self-interest as the largest trading partner and the investor, now investing in various sectors. So this is the context for the Chinese role in G20. So let me stop here. I forgot to mention about the health sector, which is not really formally part of the G20 process, but nevertheless gaining storm because of the COVID-related events. China suggests that it had donated or sold or given in aid vaccines to different countries, and also provided PPEs and other medical assistance to the developing countries in relation to the COVID-19. Although it doesn't say where COVID has originated, why it has originated. The WHO delegations have not been given access to the ground zero patient in Wuhan, and hence those questions still arise on the responsibility of a rising country like China on COVID pandemic and others. So let me stop here, and I'm willing to take questions on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Wonderfully, we always know.
If I can reply for this. As I was mentioning before, G20 primary concern is economic development. You brought in Aksai Chin, POK and others, which are geopolitical issues. I don't think G20 is going to make any statement on those issues, nor any discussions related to this, because these are bilateral issues which multilateral processes do not allow for. There may be a bi-lane meeting between the concerned parties, and like the expected meeting between Xi Jinping and Modi in South Africa today or tomorrow. So this will be outside the format of the G20. But now that you raised an issue of geopolitical, I just do not want to shirk away with the G20 as economic, because already in G20 we are discussing Ukrainian conflict. That has become since Bali meeting last year, the geopolitical issues have also been raised. But I am sure that Aksai Chin and POK will never figure in the G20 meeting. We'll never in the sense of at least this session in Delhi, because it's a bilateral issue, and multilateral issue institutions do not discuss the bilateral. But having said that, on Home Minister Amit Shah's statement in the Parliament in August 2019 on recovering POK and Aksai Chin, Dr. Jaishankar, on his visit to Beijing soon after that, he clarified that this is a domestic debate, and that the Indian policy has not changed vis-a-vis the territorial dispute with China. So that clarification meant that it is mainly a political kind of statement. One does not know if the Indian armed forces are capable of taking on the POK and Aksai Chin, because both concerned parties are nuclear. The three parties are nuclear, and so there is a major issue there in terms of strategic level of conflict that this could go on. So that is one. Since Dr. Jaishankar himself clarified on this, so I would suggest that you get to the to that aspect. I'm forgetting the second question. Sorry. There is already some dissonance in China on some aspects, although there is also coordination. When you prepare the final draft, you have a number of meetings that are held. The financial ministers meeting, the RBI, the central bank meetings, Sherpas meetings, and so on and so forth. And so obviously there are discussions related to the agenda items when these have to be finalized, and a joint statement has to be made, a declaration has to be made. So some of the issues they are cooperating on is obviously on how do we keep the financial stability on, and economic growth rates. China is also a concerned party with the current Sino-US decoupling process. As you know, the Chinese economy grew at around 14% in the mid-90s, and by 2010 they have reduced to about 10%, and last year about 3.3%. This year the Premier mentioned in the National People's Congress that they will grow at around 5.5% expected for this year, as against 8.7% for India. This also means that China is a concerned party on the economic growth rates within the G20 coordination mechanism. How do we keep these growth rates moving? And everyone is now interlinked, and so the Chinese economic growth rates is a concern for the rest of the world as well. And as the chair mentioned, there is the deflationary trends in China that is also need to be factored in, partly because the Chinese have become the manufacturing hub of the world, and so the effects that any country can have which are dependent on China, those 128 countries with which China has become the largest trading partner, that's a main concern. So there is some coordination on that aspect on how to keep up the growth rates. That is one consensus. Second, financial stability. How do we reform the financial institutions? As you know, in 2010, the IMF has been reorganized, and India, the BRICS countries made some efforts in this, and as a result of that, the IMF voting shares have been tweaked. Today, the Chinese have about 5.6 or so percentage of voting rights, which is still a problematic because China is the second largest economy. Still, they have only about 5.6% or so of the voting rights. India's voting rights have also been increased to about 3% now after the 2010 reorganization. That means there is the clamor for more opening up of the IMF and the other Bretton Woods institutions for the developing countries. So this is another coordination at the G20. And the Chinese yuan renminbi has become the strategic reserve since then, and so the Chinese demands have also increased further in reforming the financial structure of the world. So this is also where India is negotiating on. And the third item is in terms of the regional trading systems, which the BRICS is discussing this afternoon, so there is some of these climate change is another area where we have India-China coordination on some of these issues. WTO dispute resolution is another, although the Indian candidate lost for a Chinese in the WTO Deputy Director General position, Ambassador Mohan Kumar lost for a Chinese in this process. Nevertheless, I think WTO is another area where they are. Having said that, there is also the Chinese dissonance in the recent times on India's. Number one is when, as the speaker yesterday was mentioning, the former foreign secretary and the coordinator for G20, that there are over 190 meetings that took place so far, and some 50 odd items have been already, there is some consensus on those issues. So in one of the meetings was in Jammu and Kashmir, and so the Chinese have not attended that meeting. So this is one area where we find that dissonance. Second is, as the speaker yesterday was mentioning about the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which the Chinese objected to as a Sanskrit term, and so this has been, but then the translation is still there in the logo in the so there are these aspects that we come across. Increasingly also on Ukraine conflict, there is the 2:18 that since Bali we have seen that trend has increased further, which means then Russia, China as one block and the rest of 18 as another block. This is what we expect again as part of the Delhi summit meeting declaration, which then means that China and India do not agree on the Ukrainian conflict and the various aspects of how do we resolve that problem. So I think three main primary areas of differences between China and India on the G20.
Thanks, Professor, for a very insightful lecture. 2 points. Though you mentioned about the decoupling, how is China seeing repeated strident calls for decoupling or maybe de-risking from China? So I think that is one. The other point also is what is happening actually that because of the geopolitical contest, states are making economic choices based on strategic calculus, not purely in economics. So China might be a leader of globalization, all that is true, but now states are increasingly making those choices based on their own strategic calculus. So how is China seeing that and responding to that?
Background. I mean, these are 24 trillion, 19.6 trillion economies. Together constitute significant economic, potential capability of the world, and so there is the concern on how is this resolved, where is that heading, in what way, and increasingly, as Goh Chok Tong mentioned, we are now forced to choose between China and the US. The Singapore senior leader mentioned in a recent comment. That suggests then we are heading for a difficult situation across the globe if the decoupling process intensifies between the two. Now, as you know, the Trump administration initiated the trade war, tariff wars. They identified some $250 billion items, and then on which the tariffs have been imposed. Chinese retaliated on all of these, but since the United States exports something like $150 to $200 billion, While China exports nearly 570, the total trade is about $570 billion between US and China, and out of this is about $450 billion is the Chinese exports, while 150 to 200 billion is the American exports to China. So in other words, trade deficits have increased substantially between the two. Trump, during his election campaign, the previous election campaign, used some colorful words to explain what it means for the United States, which I cannot say this in this room. But what is important is that the US-China retaliated with each other, and that has gone up in terms of the quality of relations. For example, this has spilled over into the semiconductor ban. Last October, the Americans imposed a $130 billion trade ban on Huawei and ZTE, Chongqing, and that resulted in the Chinese restructuring. One of the agendas in G20 is innovation, which includes AI, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, and a host of other things in relation to the R&D. So one of the measures of the US ban on China is scuttling of the innovation efforts. Although China reached a level where they still have huge potential for developing these AI and other cloud computing, quantum computing, and other critical technologies. So, which is also related to the G20 process. The 5 items that we see in the possibly in the declaration, that includes innovation and R&D, and this is an area which has become contentious between US and China. So the decoupling is happening on the ground. So let me say some basics about China US. There are 77,000 American companies now in China, and about $700 billion investment. US invested $100 billion in India, but 700 in China. Although both the regimes are different, one is democracy, the other is Communist Party led. Yet with the engagement policy, they have invested this much in. Prior to COVID-19, 6,000 people used to go from China to the US or US to China every day, compared to about 300 people who go from India to China or vice versa. That's the intensity of people-to-people relations in China-US relations. Today there are visa curbs and a lot of restrictions on Chinese going to the US. So this meant that the tariff wars have resulted in a lot of friction, and there is also the plan B that many of these American companies are now thinking about. There are some 200 companies who have come to India. We have also the Foxconn, which is now manufacturing iPhones in India, or other semiconductor industries. Micron company employees were arrested in the US last year, and one of the things is they have passed a intelligence law in 2017, and anybody can be arrested based on kind of information the Chinese receive. So Micron employees, Bain and Company employees, some of them were arrested. And you remember that when Prime Minister Modi visited United States last month, there is the Micron investing $830 billion in Gujarat for the semiconductor industry. So there is also the fallback that we see, or an alternative that we see from the US companies shifting to India. It is a kind of benefit for India in terms of this decoupling process. We are likely to see the G20 having frictions on this aspect in terms of the US agenda, which primarily has now become on the Ukrainian conflict, and the US-China conflict at the G20 level. So across the spectrum, we have seen, despite Biden's 4 meetings with Xi Jinping virtual meetings and the Bali meeting, sideline meeting. Despite all this, we see that the friction levels are high, and Janet Yellen, Blinken visit and Kissinger's visit did not yield much from China on the US-China related matters. So it is likely to have a spillover effect on the G20, but mainly in the format of Ukrainian conflict. Nevertheless, I must say that US and China still have a lot of consensus. For example, on the global markets, globalization, during Trump administration, they walked away from WHO and the CPTPP, but Biden administration has rejoined many of those or rekindled the globalization aspect. So there is consensus both between China and the US on that aspect. Financial stability, there is still a consensus on both sides on, although China wants to have renminbi more internationalized, and also are interested in de-dollarization debate. If you see the Saudi-Iran deal that they cobbled up, all this suggests that while there is some consensus, there is a lot of competition between them in the G20 process as well. Yeah, good question, but it is very unlikely that the G20 declaration will have anything on terrorism. Nevertheless, on economic disruptions caused by terrorism, this is one area the G20 could reflect on in the discussions as well as in the final declaration. The economic disruptions caused by terrorism. Of course, during COVID, we saw that we have a lot of news about, it is reported that there is online recruitment, and so digital connectivity and all others, now there is a recruitment. One. Second, use of COVID related virus sprays by the terrorists. This is a second item which could be part of the G20 discussions on how do we curb the terrorism related matters. NSA Ajit Doval had mentioned time and again on the terrorism aspect, and in every meeting he had mentioned about the counter-terrorism issues and so on. But I think it is unlikely to be a major item in the G20. It's purely economic. Bali summit changed that into Ukraine conflict, geopolitical issues. They did raise some geopolitical issues before, but Bali was the first time when geopolitical issues overshadowed the geo-economic issues in the G20. It is unlikely that there will be any major change. Of course, we know that Ukraine still is a major item in the G20, and we would be surprised if no joint statement is issued other than the Bali summit passages being once again mentioned in the next G20 meeting.
We go beyond that, like biological warfare.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Emerging issues.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. That's a good question. No clear answers yet. The RBI is in discussions with the Bank of China on the currency swap and local currency related trade between the two. We are now $125 billion trade, and during the Indian purchases of Russian oil, we have used the renminbi also as a transaction, but that is done by the private companies like Reliance or Adani's, so it's not a government of India policy as such, but nevertheless there is a RBI discussion with the counterparts in China. We used to have a financial dialogue between India and China and a strategic and economic dialogue. All of them shut down due to Galwan incident. And so that is, so the discussion is not yet, not continuing now on this. But as we will see in the BRICS declaration today, we may see the local currencies and local trading in regional currencies, that topic is going to come up in the BRICS discussions. Now, when you look at the global transactions, some 56% of global transactions are in the US dollar, and some 20 odd in the UK pound and euro, another 20 odd percentage. I'm not very sure about the exact figures, but renminbi, and then there is the Japanese yen, which is also another major currency. The renminbi is only very small, some 3 to 4% of global transactions. But increasingly, the Russia-China trade is conducted in the renminbi ruble. Intra-BRICS trade, they are proposing that they conduct in the regional currencies. And so this also the BRI projects, BRI trade, that is with so many countries that China has there is a likelihood that the regional currencies will be used as part of the transactions. But this is a tall order for de-dollarization, dollar being replaced as global currency in the near future, and renminbi becoming a global currency. It's a tall order right now. For at least a decade or two, we cannot expect the current reality changing. So from 3%, possibly they may go up to 6%, 7% at the most, and very likely that they have the global currency status, meaning in terms of what we saw, the US dollar after the 1972 arrangement with Saudi Arabia. The US dollar has become the global currency. So it's very unlikely we see renminbi taking over. So Chinese would push for in the G20 in the regional currencies, trading in regional currencies, which is gathering storm in the BRICS and others. So this is one area where it is likely to happen in the G20 as well. So I do not see substantial progress. China would push through this, but we are unlikely to see the US dollar being replaced. It's an aspirational one, but we don't see that happening overnight for at least a decade or two. So, so that is on currencies. We are in SIS, so we should go back to the basics. Robert Keohane, Regge, Joseph Nye. Multilateralism means 3 or more countries joining, inclusive in terms of membership, non-specificity of the enemy, that you can't call the other as an enemy if you're joining a multilateral institution. So inclusiveness is part of the multilateral aspect. So quickly I wanted to respond on that. So there is no inclusive multilateralism or exclusive multilateralism. Multilateralism means inclusiveness. You follow the theory, then it is part of that.
China and United States, they will join hand to put Russia in a difficult situation in the longer run. Because I'm not talking about in the shorter term, because the Russians, they always say their long-term enemy is China. So in that context, how do you visualize the state of international relations? Because recently Sanjay Balu wrote a very interesting piece where he talked about bi-multipolarity, taking a cue from Samuel Huntington's article. So in that context, how do you visualize the state of international relations? Thank you.
And Deng Xiaoping went to the White House, and Carter-Deng Xiaoping arrangement or agreement or understanding was how to disintegrate the Soviet Union. And a fellow communist now trying to disintegrate the other communists. That was the deal struck in '79, and the NATO gave briefings to the Chinese Communist Party leaders when Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. They also supported the Mujahideen. Both of them supported the Mujahideen, which has now become the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So there is a template before on China, US coming together to counter the Soviets. Obama also had a similar one when he proposed the G2, Brzezinski's idea on G2. While the Chinese rejected this explicitly, but implicitly they are happy that they were considered as part of the G2 with the United States. And unlike in 79, there are many other targets in 2009 when this was proposed, which includes Russia, which includes India. James Steinberg's intervention in the joint statement of Obama, Hu Jintao included the South Asian region as part of the China-US security relations. So Russia is one of the elements in the trilateral US-China-Russia relations. And in this current conflict, Ukrainian conflict, the three have come about. And of course, this has resulted in the China-US competition increasing substantially. Because the limitless partnership that was announced between Putin and Xi Jinping in February last year, that is now reflected in the Security Council debates, in the General Assembly debates, and in general we saw also in the G20, the Russians and Chinese have come together in this geopolitical aspect. So there is the Russia factor in the overall US-China relations. As Putin wrote long ago in New York Times, the Americans still consider the Cold War going on and they target the Russians on that aspect. So the major beneficiary of course is China, so I think the Russia factor is quite explicit, including in the current Ukrainian conflict. No, we are not doing anything to counter China in the G20 process. We are expecting Xi Jinping to come, and so there are no efforts to counter China on this issue on G20 meeting. Of course, as we are speaking, there are huge forces mobilized. It is estimated that India had mobilized 120,000 troops, while China had mobilized about 70,000 troops in the Ladakh Aksai Chin sector. So they are almost eyeball to eyeball. That means we are in an adversarial relationship. Why did you mention about the virus issue? Any connection to? That is what economic interdependencies have resulted in. You can't take action. Harshvardhan was the health minister, and we were the leaders of WHA. We were the president of WHA when the discussions were taking place. Australia raised the issue of origins of the virus, and China pounced on Australia. The $120 billion trade was affected, and of course the Australians were able to maneuver and get new clients for their products. So they were not really affected by the trade conflict at that time, but we would have had a difficult situation, and so the Indian health minister did not say anything which is critical of China during the virus. I wrote an article on the virus saying that this is a bioweapon, and I've given some evidence, and there are some explicit comments on me in China, which is quite encouraging for me to write more on China. So the COVID-19 has been a very testing time for the rest of the world, and China allowed the delegations, but did not allow 2-3 specific things that are required for going into the origins of the virus. One is the drainage samples. That is essential for finding out where the virus came from, whether it is a laboratory or is it through the pangolins or other wild animals. On this you require the drainage samples. Second, you require the blood samples during the 2019 October-November, when the virus started spreading and patients some 57 patients were declared to be of a different strain of the virus, that is coronavirus, novel coronavirus. So China did not allow so far these samples to be tested. That is, and nobody was allowed into the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the and none of the virologists were interviewed. So it's a different system. China follows a different system, so we do not know. Maybe it will take 100 years for us to say that COVID-19 is laboratory generated.
Me in thanking Professor Kondapalli with a big round of applause. The sheer
Thank you.
numbers that you